Good evening, pals, and welcome back. Tonight, let us begin a slow journey across the islands of Japan, not as travelers in a hurry, and not as students trying to memorize dates, names, and battles, but as quiet listeners moving gently through time. We are going to travel across forests and mountains, through old villages, ancient capitals, Buddhist temples, samurai strongholds, and eventually into the modern world. But for tonight, we will begin at the very beginning, in a Japan that had no emperors, no written records, no castles, no cities, and no name by which its people would have recognized themselves as part of a single nation. Before Japan became known for Tokyo's bright skyline, Kyoto's old wooden temples, the elegance of tea ceremony, or the quiet beauty of its gardens, it was an archipelago of wild coastlines, dense forests, volcanic mountains, and rivers that carried life through the valleys. Long before history was written down, human beings came to these islands and slowly learned how to live with them. So before we begin, take a slow breath. Let yourself settle into the story. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to come back for more. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now, let the room grow calm around you. Let the present moment fade just a little. And let me take you back to the earliest world of Japan, long before the first emperor, long before the first capital, long before the first written words, when the islands were still mostly forest, river mist, and sea. The first human footsteps on the Japanese islands. The first human presence in the Japanese islands reaches far back into the Paleolithic era, at least 35,000 years ago, and perhaps even earlier. It is difficult to imagine such a distance in time. 35,000 years is older than any city, older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the oldest kingdoms we usually speak of when we tell the story of civilization. It carries us back to a world shaped by ice-changing coastlines and human communities who moved carefully through landscapes that were both generous and dangerous. During the Ice Age, sea levels were lower than they are today. The Japanese islands were not connected to the Asian mainland in exactly the same way at all times, but the distances between lands were different, and movement across the region was easier in some places than it would later become. Groups of hunter-gatherers crossed into the archipelago, bringing with them knowledge of stone tools, hunting, fire, and survival in difficult environments. They did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as small groups of human beings looking for food, shelter, and a place to continue living. Their world was immediate and physical. The shape of a valley mattered. The movement of animals mattered. The season of a fruiting tree mattered. A sharp blade of obsidian could mean the difference between hunger and survival. A sheltered place near water could become a temporary home. A fire at night could hold back cold darkness and fear. Archaeologists have found stone tools, blades, flakes, and traces of temporary shelters from this deep past. These fragments are small, but they are powerful. A tool made from stone is not just an object. It is evidence of a hand, a decision, a skill passed from one person to another. Someone chose the stone. Someone struck it with care. Someone shaped an edge sharp enough to cut meat, scrape hide, or prepare wood. In that small object, we can feel the presence of a human mind reaching across tens of thousands of years. Imagine one of those early mornings. The air is cold and mist lies low among the trees. A group wakes beside the remains of a fire. The older members know where the river bends, where fish might be found, and where animals left tracks the day before. Children watch and learn. They learn which berries are safe, which roots can be eaten, how to carry embers, how to listen for movement in the forest, and how to stay close when the land becomes unfamiliar. For these early people, Japan was not yet a country. It was a living landscape. It offered deer, boar, fish, shellfish, birds, nuts, roots, and wood. But it also brought storms, cold winters, earthquakes, volcanic activity, and the constant uncertainty of life without permanent agriculture. Survival depended on memory and cooperation. No one lived alone for long in such a world. A group needed hunters, gatherers, tool makers, fire keepers, elders, and children who would carry knowledge into the next generation. Most of what they thought, feared, loved, and believed has disappeared. They left no poems and no written prayers. Yet their presence remains in the ground in stone, in fragments, and in the long human continuity that followed them. They were the first known people to leave their marks on the Japanese islands, and although we cannot name them, we can pause for a moment and acknowledge them. They began the human story of Japan not with palaces or armies, but with footsteps on damp earth fires beneath the night sky and the quiet work of staying alive. Over many thousands of years, these early ways of life slowly changed. The climate shifted, the coastlines changed, forests expanded, new food sources became available, human communities became more settled, more rooted, and more expressive. Out of that long transition emerged one of the most remarkable prehistoric cultures in the world, the Jomon. The Jomon world, forests, coasts, villages, and seasons. The Jomon period began around 14,000 BCE and lasted for more than 10,000 years. That length of time alone is almost difficult to hold in the mind. Many civilizations rise and fall within a few centuries. Empires appear, expand, weaken, and vanish. But the Jomon way of life endured across millennia, adapting to changing climates and landscapes while preserving a deep continuity of culture. The name Jomon means cord marked, a reference to the patterns pressed into wet clay before pottery was fired. But the Jomon period was far more than a pottery style. It was a long world of villages, forests, shell mounds, rituals, food gathering, fishing craftsmanship, and community life. The Jomon people lived mainly as hunter-gatherers, but they were not wandering aimlessly from place to place. Many of their settlements were relatively stable, located near rivers, forests, lakes, and coasts, where food could be gathered from several environments at once. Let us imagine a Jomon village in the soft light of early morning. The homes are pit dwellings partly dug into the earth with wooden frames and roofs of thatch or bark. Smoke rises from hearths inside or near the dwellings. The village may be arranged around an open space where people gather, work, cook, repair tools, or take part in seasonal rituals. Nearby children move between adults watching tasks being done and slowly learning the skills they will need. Some people prepare food. Others mend nets, shape tools, split wood, or sort nuts gathered from the forest. The village is not isolated from nature. It is part of it. Beyond the dwellings, the forest begins. In spring, new plants appear. In summer, rivers and coastlines provide fish and shellfish. In autumn, nuts such as chestnuts, walnuts, and acorns become especially important. In winter, stored food matters deeply, and the ability to preserve, process, and share resources becomes essential. The Jomon diet was varied and often abundant depending on the region. Along the coasts, people collected shellfish, caught fish, hunted sea mammals in some areas, and gathered seaweed and other marine resources. Inland, they hunted deer, boar, and smaller animals. They gathered berries, roots, fruits, and nuts. Acorns and chestnuts were especially important, but they often required preparation before they could be eaten safely. Grinding stones, storage pits, and charred remains of seeds tell us that plant foods played a major role in everyday life. One of the most striking traces of Jomon life is the shell midden, a mound made from discarded shells, animal bones, broken tools, pottery fragments, and other remains of daily living. To a casual eye, a shell mound might look like a heap of waste, but to archaeologists, it is a record of meals, seasons, tools, habits, and long-term settlement. It tells us that people returned again and again to the same places. It tells us what they ate, what they made, and how they lived beside the sea. There is something quietly moving about that. A shell discarded after a meal thousands of years ago still speaks. It says that someone sat by a fire, opened food from the sea, ate with others, and left behind a small trace of an ordinary day. History is often told through rulers and battles, but here in the Jomon world, history is held in the remains of meals, hearths, storage pits, and worn tools. The Jomon people were skilled in using the materials around them. Stone tools were made for cutting, scraping, grinding, and hunting. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that can form a very sharp edge, was especially valuable. It was traded across long distances along with jade and other rare materials. The movement of these objects shows that Jomon communities were not completely separate from one another. They interacted, exchanged goods, and likely shared stories, techniques, and ritual ideas across the islands. This long-distance exchange is important because it reminds us that Jomon society had networks. It had memory beyond a single village. A piece of obsidian found far from its source suggests travel, trade, gift exchange, or relationships between communities. These people may not have had written maps, but they knew routes through mountains, along rivers, and across coastal paths. They knew who lived beyond the next valley where certain stones could be found, and perhaps when gatherings or exchanges might take place. Jomon villages could vary in size. Some were small, perhaps occupied seasonally. Others were larger and more permanent, with dozens of dwellings. Some settlements appear to have had open central spaces, perhaps used for gatherings, rituals, or shared work. The arrangement of dwellings suggests that social organization mattered even if there is little evidence for sharp class divisions. Unlike later periods where graves show clear differences in status and wealth, Jomon burials tend to be more modest. Some individuals were buried with ornaments or tools, but there were no enormous tombs for kings, no palaces, no grand monuments of conquest. This does not mean there was no leadership. There may have been elders, skilled hunters, ritual specialists, healers, or people whose knowledge gave them influence. But power seems to have been less rigid and less institutionalized than in later agricultural societies. The Jomon world appears to have been organized around community kinship, seasonal rhythms, and shared ritual life rather than centralized authority. And yet, it would be a mistake to imagine the Jomon as people living in perfect peace or simplicity. Their world had danger. Storms could destroy coastal settlements. Food supplies could fail. Illness could spread. Injuries from hunting could be fatal. Winters could be difficult. The dead had to be mourned. Children had to be protected. The unknown had to be explained somehow. In such a world, ritual likely mattered deeply. The boundary between practical life and spiritual life may not have been as clear as it is for many people today. Hunting, gathering, birth sickness, death, seasonal change, and the movement of animals could all carry spiritual meaning. The forest was not merely a collection of trees. The sea was not merely water. The land was alive with forces that human beings needed to respect, fear, think, and understand. The Jomon people lived close to those forces. Their lives were shaped by the sound of rain on roofs, the smell of smoke in a dwelling, the sight of fish drying, the feel of clay in the hand, and the patience required to wait for the right season. Their culture endured because it adapted. It did not depend on a single crop. It drew from many sources. It balanced forest, river, and sea. For thousands of years, this way of life continued. Villages changed, pottery styles changed, climate changed, but the Jomon people remained rooted in a relationship with the islands that was both practical and spiritual. They built no empire, but they created a way of living that lasted longer than almost any empire in history. And in the quiet remains they left behind, we can still sense a world where survival was not separate from beauty and where ordinary daily life slowly became culture. Jomon pottery, dog, figurines, rituals, and belief. Among the most beautiful and mysterious legacies of the Jomon period is its pottery. Some of the earliest Jomon vessels were simple and practical, made for boiling food, storing resources, or preparing meals. But over time, especially during the Middle Jomon period, pottery became increasingly elaborate. The rims of some vessels rose in dramatic shapes, curling and twisting like flames, waves, or living forms. Their surfaces were marked with patterns made by pressing cord into wet clay, along with other designs shaped by hand. It is easy to think of pottery as a household object, something ordinary and useful. And much Jomon pottery was exactly that. A pot could hold food, water, nuts, or stew. It could sit near a fire. It could help transform raw ingredients into something warm and nourishing. In that sense, pottery changed daily life. It allowed people to cook in new ways, to soften foods, to process plants, and to store what they needed. But some Jomon pottery seems to go beyond ordinary use. Certain vessels were so decorated, so carefully shaped, and so dramatic in appearance that they may have served ceremonial purposes. They were not merely containers. They were expressions of imagination, skill, and perhaps belief. When we look at them today, we are not simply seeing old clay. We are seeing the hands of people who took time to make beauty from earth, water, fire, and pressure. Think for a moment of the act itself. Someone gathers clay. Someone kneads it, shapes it, smooths it, presses cord into its surface, builds the rim, and prepares it for firing. The object must survive heat. It may crack, it may fail, but when it succeeds, it becomes something durable, something that can outlast the person who made it by thousands of years. There is something almost tender about that. A human hand pressed a pattern into clay, and the mark remained. The person disappeared into time, but the pressure of the hand stayed behind. The Jomon also created clay figurines known as dogu. These small statues are among the most recognizable objects from prehistoric Japan. Many have exaggerated features, large eyes, wide hips, small waists, patterned bodies, or abstract shapes that do not try to copy the human form exactly. Some look almost otherworldly. Others feel deeply human, connected perhaps to birth, illness, protection, or spiritual transformation. The exact meaning of dogu is still debated. We cannot ask the people who made them what they believed. But many scholars think the figurines may have been connected to fertility, healing, protection, or ritual practices. A number of dogs have been found deliberately broken, which suggests that breaking them may have been part of their purpose. Scholars still debate the meaning of these figurines, but many believe they were connected to healing, protection, fertility, or ritual life. The fact that some dogs were deliberately broken suggests that the act itself may have carried meaning, as if the object could hold a fear, an illness, or a misfortune before being destroyed in a controlled and symbolic way. Their purpose may not have been the same everywhere, but they clearly belonged to a world where clay, body, spirit, and community were closely connected. What matters for our story is not that we solve every mystery. Some mysteries should remain quiet. What matters is that the Jomon people clearly lived in a world of symbolic objects and ritual action. They made things that were not only useful, but meaningful. They shaped clay into forms that carried hopes, fears, prayers, and ideas that we can only partly understand. The Jomon relationship with death also reveals a thoughtful ritual life. Burials varied across regions and periods. Some people were buried in shell mounds. Others were placed in graves with ornaments, tools, or red ochre. In some places, stone arrangements and stone circles suggest ceremonial spaces, perhaps connected to ancestors' seasonal gatherings or the movements of the sun and moon. The use of red ochre is especially evocative. Red pigment appears in many prehistoric cultures around the world and is often associated with blood, life, death, and renewal. When placed with the dead, it may have carried meanings of protection, transformation, or passage into another state of being. We cannot know exactly what the Jomon believed about death, but their burial practices show that the dead were not simply discarded. They were placed, treated, remembered, and perhaps accompanied by objects that mattered. Stone circles too suggest that certain places held special meaning. A circle of stones requires planning. People must gather the stones, arrange them, and return to the site. Such places may have been used for seasonal ceremonies, ancestor rituals, or gatherings that brought communities together. In a society without written calendars, ritual spaces may have helped mark time, memory, and belonging. The Jomon world was deeply connected to nature, but not in a vague or romantic way. It was connected because life depended on that connection. The forest gave food and materials. The sea gave fish and shellfish. Rivers gave water and movement. Animals gave meat, bone, hide, and meaning. Seasonal change shaped every decision. It is easy to imagine that spiritual life grew naturally from this closeness. When your survival depends on the return of fish, the fall of nuts, the movement of deer, and the timing of weather, the natural world cannot feel distant or silent. It feels powerful. It feels present. Later, Japanese religious traditions, especially the reverence for kami and Shinto, would place great importance on sacred places in nature, mountains, trees, rocks, waterfalls, groves, and ancestral spirits. We should be careful not to say that Jomon religion and later Shinto were exactly the same. Too much time separates them, but it is reasonable to sense a deep continuity in the Japanese relationship with nature, ritual, and place. The Jomon people may have helped lay the earliest emotional and spiritual foundations for a culture that would continue to see the natural world as alive with presence. Across more than 10,000 years, the Jomon period changed many times. Archaeologists divide it into phases: incipient, initial, early, middle, late, and final. Pottery styles shifted. Settlements grew and shrank. Climate warmed and cooled. The sea rose after the Ice Age, changing coastlines and reshaping the places where people lived. Forests expanded, then later environmental pressures forced communities to adapt again. But through these changes, there was continuity. There was pottery, there were villages, there were rituals, there was food gathered from forest and sea. There was a way of life built not on conquest, but on adjustment, memory, and balance. The Jomon people did not leave behind written histories, but they left behind something quieter: marks in clay dwellings in the earth, shells beside old fires, figurines broken with intention, stones arranged in circles, and graves that suggest care for the dead. These remains do not speak loudly. They do not announce kings or victories. Instead, they whisper of human beings who lived carefully within their world. And perhaps that is why the Jomon period is such a gentle place to begin the story of Japan. Before the rise of emperors, before the arrival of Buddhism, before the poetry of Kyoto, before the age of samurai and shoguns, there were people sitting beside fires, shaping clay with their hands, listening to the sea, watching the forest, and trusting that the seasons would return. Their world would eventually change. New people, new crops, new tools, and new ways of organizing society would arrive from across the water. The long Jomon age would slowly give way to another transformation. But for now, let us remain for one quiet moment in that older Japan, a land of smoke rising from pit dwellings of shell mounds near the shore of clay vessels, warming beside the fire, and of small human communities living beneath the same mountains and stars that still watch over the islands today. From Jomon to Yayoi, a quiet change across the water. The Jomon world did not end in a single moment. There was no one morning when people woke beside their hearths and found that everything they knew had vanished. The old ways continued for a long time. People still gathered nuts from the forest, still fished along the shore, still used clay vessels, still buried their dead with care, and still lived close to the rivers, mountains, and sea. But across the western waters, through the narrow routes that connected the Japanese islands with the Korean peninsula and the wider Asian mainland, new things slowly began to arrive. At first, these changes may have seemed small. A new kind of tool, a new way to shape metal, a different style of pottery, a handful of people carrying unfamiliar knowledge. Seeds and techniques that belong to another rhythm of life. These were not the dramatic symbols of empire or conquest. They were quiet things, practical things carried by migrants, traders and travelers who crossed the sea in search of land, exchange, opportunity, or safety. Yet history often begins to change through small objects. A blade of iron can change the way wood is cut. A bronze ornament can change the way status is displayed. A seed can change the way time itself is understood. And among all the changes that reached Japan during this long transition, none would prove more important than wet rice agriculture. Rice was not simply another food. It required a different relationship with land, labor, and community. A field had to be prepared, water had to be directed, planting had to happen at the right time. Harvesting had to be organized. Grain had to be stored, protected, counted, and distributed. Once people depended on rice fields, they could not move as freely as before. Their lives became more fixed to particular places, particular seasons, and particular systems of cooperation. In the older Jomon world, survival had come from many directions. At once the forest, the shoreline, the river, the hunt, the shellfish bed, the nut-bearing trees of autumn. The Yayoi way of life, which gradually spread from western Japan, placed much greater emphasis on cultivation. It did not remove fishing, hunting, or gathering completely, but it gave rice a central place in daily life and social organization. The transition was gradual and uneven. In some regions, Jomon traditions remained strong for centuries. In others, especially in northern Kyushu and western Honshu, the new agricultural techniques took root earlier and spread more deeply. This means that ancient Japan was not changing everywhere at the same speed. The islands were full of regional differences, local mixtures, and communities living between old habits and new possibilities. We should imagine this transition not as a door closing, but as two worlds overlapping. In one village, people may have still relied heavily on fishing and forest gathering, while using a few new tools from the continent. In another, rice fields may have already begun to shape the rhythm of the year. Some families may have intermarried with newcomers. Some communities may have adopted new practices quickly, while others held on to older ways for generations. Culture rarely moves like a clean line on a map. It moves through contact, imitation, resistance, curiosity, need, and memory. The people of this transitional age probably did not think of themselves as living at the edge of a historical period. They were simply solving the problems of ordinary life. They were deciding where to plant, where to fish, how to store food, whom to trust, and how to respond when neighboring communities became wealthier, stronger, or better connected. But slowly, the meaning of settlement began to change. A village was no longer only a place near good food sources. It became tied to fields. A successful harvest could support more people. More people could create larger communities. Larger communities needed clearer leadership. Stored grain created value, and value had to be guarded. From there, new forms of power could grow. There is a quiet beauty in this transformation, but also a kind of tension. The arrival of rice brought security, but also responsibility. It brought abundance, but also competition. It made larger communities possible, but it also made inequality easier to see. A pot of gathered nuts could be shared within a small group. A storehouse full of rice could be counted, controlled, defended, and claimed. As we leave the Jomon world behind, we should not imagine that it disappeared completely. Its people, traditions, and ways of seeing nature continued to shape the islands, but the center of gravity was shifting. The future of Japan would no longer be formed only around the forest and the sea. It would also be formed around the rice field, the storehouse, the village boundary, and the authority of those who could organize labor and protect resources. The old world of cord-marked pottery and pit dwellings was giving way to another age. The change came slowly, like water entering a field. And from that water, a new Japan began to grow. The Yayoi world, rice fields, metal, and settled villages. The Yayoi period is usually dated from around 300 BCE to around 300 CE, though the beginnings of its culture reach earlier in some regions. Its name comes from a district in Tokyo where a new style of pottery was discovered in the late 19th century. Compared with the dramatic and often ornate pottery of the Jomon Yayoi pottery, appears simpler, smoother, more balanced, and more practical. That difference in style reflects a deeper change in life. The Yayoi world was shaped by rice. To understand this period, it helps to begin with a field in the morning. The ground is wet. The air is cool. Water rests in shallow squares of prepared earth, reflecting the pale sky above. Nearby, people are already working their feet sinking into the mud as they tend to young rice plants. The work is repetitive, but it is not mindless. Every movement belongs to a larger cycle, preparing the field, controlling the water planting, waiting, weeding, harvesting, drying, storing, and beginning again. In this kind of life, the calendar becomes more demanding. A hunter-gatherer community also follows seasons, of course, but rice agriculture ties people to a particular schedule with unusual force. If the water is not managed well, the crop can fail. If the planting comes too late, the harvest may suffer. If the grain is not stored properly, months of labor can be lost to dampness pests or theft. The Yayoi people built their villages around this new relationship with the land. Settlements became more permanent and more organized. Houses were often built near fields, waterways, and storage areas. Raised floor granaries became an important feature of village life, lifting precious rice above the damp ground and away from animals. These structures were more than practical buildings. They represented a new kind of wealth, one that could be seen guarded and measured. A storehouse changes the atmosphere of a village. It means that the future has been brought into the present. Inside are meals not yet eaten, labor already completed, and security that must be protected. It also means that some people may begin to control what others need. The person who manages grain, organizes labor, or protects the fields gains a kind of influence that did not exist in the same way before. Rice did not completely replace older foods. People still fished, hunted, gathered plants, and used the resources of the coast and forest. The Japanese islands were too varied for one way of life to erase all others. But rice became the foundation around which many communities organized themselves. It could feed growing populations, support larger settlements, and create surpluses that allowed some people to specialize in tasks beyond daily food production. Metal technology arrived alongside these changes, and it too altered the rhythm of life. Iron tools made farming, woodworking, and construction more efficient. A stronger blade could cut trees, shape wood, repair structures, and prepare fields with greater ease than stone tools alone. Bronze, meanwhile, often served more symbolic or ritual purposes. bronze mirrors, weapons, and bells carried prestige. They connected local leaders to continental networks of exchange and gave physical form to authority. The large bronze bells, known as dotaku, are among the most intriguing objects of the Yayoi period. Their exact use is still debated, but many scholars connect them with agricultural ceremonies, seasonal rites, or rituals meant to ensure good harvests. Some were buried in groups suggesting that they were not simply musical instruments or decorative objects. They belonged to a world where farming ritual leadership and the unseen forces of nature were closely linked. This connection between agriculture and ritual makes sense. A community, depending on rice, could not fully control the weather, insects, floods, droughts, or disease. People could work carefully and still lose a crop. In such a world, ceremonies around planting and harvest were not separate from survival. They were part of how a community faced uncertainty together. The Yayoi period also brought Japan into closer contact with the Asian continent. Techniques, materials, and ideas moved across the sea from Korea and China. Migrants and traders carried not only objects, but also ways of organizing society. Through these contacts, the Japanese islands became part of a broader East Asian world even before they had a centralized state or a written historical tradition of their own. For ordinary people, though, these wide historical movements would have been felt in very immediate ways. A family might spend its days maintaining a field, repairing a channel, carrying bundles of grain, weaving plant fibers, shaping pottery, or cooking rice over a fire. Children would learn not only how to gather food, but how to take part in the agricultural cycle. Elders would remember which fields flooded, which channels needed clearing, which families could be trusted, and which neighbors might become rivals. The soundscape of the Yayoi world was different from that of the Jomon forest village. There was still birdsong, rain, wind, and water, but now there was also the repeated work of cultivation tools striking earth people calling across fields, grain being processed, wooden structures being built, and perhaps the low sound of ritual bells during important ceremonies. The landscape itself changed. Wet rice fields, open spaces in valleys and lowlands. Waterways became part of human planning. Villages were tied more closely to territory. The land was not only lived in, it was measured by its productivity. A field could be inherited, disputed, defended, improved, or taken. Over time, these agricultural communities grew in size and complexity. Cooperation remained necessary, but so did coordination. Someone had to decide when work began, how water was shared, how grain was stored, and how conflicts were resolved. Leadership could emerge naturally from these needs. At first, authority may have been practical and local. Later, As surpluses increased and competition sharpened, leadership became more formal, more visible, and more closely tied to wealth and ritual power. The Yayoi period then was not only about rice, it was about what rice made possible. It made larger villages possible. It made population growth possible. It made stored wealth possible. It made social ranking more visible. It made long-term control over land more important. It encouraged trade, conflict, ritual, and political organization. In the quiet surface of a rice field, we can see the beginning of a new society. The field reflects the sky, but beneath the water are roots. Beneath the roots is labor. Around the labor are families, leaders, rituals, storehouses, alliances, and boundaries. What seems at first like a peaceful agricultural scene contains the early structure of power. And as the Yayoi centuries passed, that power would become harder to ignore. Yayoi society, status warfare, and the shadow of Himiko. As rice agriculture spread, Yayoi society became more complex. The change was gradual, but its direction was clear. Communities grew larger. Villages became more organized. Some people gained more wealth and influence than others. The old rhythms of food gathering and fishing remained, but they now existed alongside a world of field storehouses, tools, leaders, and guarded resources. Stored grain created new questions. Who had the right to control it? Who decided how it was shared? Who protected it during times of danger? Who spoke for the community when disputes arose with neighboring settlements? These questions may sound practical, but they are also political. The roots of government often begin in the management of food, water, land, and security. Archaeology gives us signs of this changing world. Burial practices from the Yayoi period show clearer differences in status than those of the Jomon. Some graves contain bronze mirrors, iron weapons ornaments, and other valuable objects. Other burials are far simpler. This contrast suggests that certain individuals or families had begun to stand above others in wealth, power, or ritual importance. The appearance of weapons in fortified settlements also tells a story. Moats, embankments, and defensive structures suggest that some communities felt the need to protect themselves. Competition between villages may have grown as population increased and productive land became more valuable. Rice fields could feed a community, but they could also attract envy. A storehouse full of grain was a promise of survival, and anything valuable enough to promise survival was valuable enough to defend. Warfare in the Yayoi period should not be imagined only as large armies moving across open plains. Much of it may have involved raids, local conflicts, struggles between neighboring groups, and the rise of leaders who could organize defense. Still, the shift is important. In the earlier Jomon record, clear evidence of warfare is limited. By the Yayoi period, conflict becomes much more visible. This does not mean that daily life was dominated by violence. Most people still spent their lives farming, fishing, cooking, repairing tools, raising children, and maintaining the fragile systems that allowed villages to survive. But the possibility of conflict changed the meaning of leadership. A person who could manage rituals, organize labor, and command warriors held a different kind of authority from an elder who was respected mainly for experience. Metal objects played a role in this world of status and power. Iron weapons and tools had practical value. Bronze mirrors and bells carried symbolic weight. Some prestige items were imported or inspired by objects from China and Korea, linking local elites to wider networks beyond the islands. To possess such an item was not only to own something beautiful or rare. It was to show connection, authority, and perhaps a special relationship with ritual power. By the later Yayoi period, Chinese historical texts begin to offer glimpses of the Japanese islands from the outside. These accounts describe a land divided into many communities or small states, some of them in conflict with one another. Among the most famous figures mentioned is Queen Himiko, ruler of a polity known as Yamatai in the 3rd century CE. Himiko stands at the edge between archaeology, history, and legend. Chinese records describe her as a female ruler who held authority through spiritual or shamanic power, and who sent envoys to the Chinese court. Her exact location remains debated. Some scholars place Yamatai in northern Kyushu, while others connect it with the Kinai region around what would later become the Yamato heartland. The debate has never fully disappeared, and that uncertainty is part of what makes her so fascinating. For our journey tonight, Himiko matters because her story reveals something important about early Japan. By the 3rd century, the islands were no longer seen only as scattered villages. They contained political communities large enough to be noticed by China, organized enough to send envoys, and complex enough to have rulers whose authority reached beyond a single settlement. The image of Himiko also reminds us that power in early Japan was not always the same as later warrior rule. Her authority, as described in Chinese sources, seems to have been connected to ritual spiritual practice and the ability to mediate between the visible and invisible worlds. In a society where agriculture depended on forces beyond human control, such authority could be deeply meaningful. A ruler who could promise order, protection, and connection with unseen powers would have held a powerful place in the imagination of her people. Still, the world of Yayoi politics was not unified. It was a mosaic of communities, rival leaders' alliances, and regional differences. Some areas adopted rice agriculture deeply. Others maintained older ways for longer. Some leaders gained control over larger territories. Others remained local. Across the islands, Japan was slowly moving toward political complexity, but it had not yet become a single state. The end of the Yayoi period marks one of the great turning points in Japanese history. By this time, the foundations of later society had already appeared: agriculture hierarchy, warfare ritual authority, long-distance exchange, and emerging political centers. The Jomon had given the islands a long tradition of adaptation, craftsmanship, and spiritual connection to nature. The Yayoi added rice fields, metals, stored wealth, social ranking, and closer ties with the continent. Together, these two worlds formed the roots from which later Japan would grow. If we look at a Yayoi village at dusk, we might see smoke rising from houses, water shining in the fields, grain stored above the ground, and a watchful awareness at the edge of the settlement. It is still a human world of families, meals, work, weather, and sleep. But beneath its quiet surface, history has begun to gather force. The land is being organized. Power is becoming visible. And somewhere beyond the next generation, the first shape of the Japanese state is beginning to emerge. Yamato and Kofun, the first shadow of the Japanese state. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Japanese islands were entering another decisive transformation. The scattered agricultural communities and rival chiefdoms of the Yayoi period did not vanish, but in parts of western and central Japan, power began to gather around larger political centers. One of these centers, located in the fertile Nara basin of central Honshu, would become especially important. It is known to history as Yamato. The rise of Yamato was not a sudden revolution. No single day marks the birth of the Japanese state. Instead, it was a long process of consolidation, negotiation, conflict, marriage alliances, ritual authority, and control over resources. Local leaders who had once ruled smaller communities began to connect themselves to wider networks of power. Some were absorbed into alliances, others resisted. Over generations, one dominant lineage rose above the rest, creating the foundations of a political order that would shape Japan for more than 1,000 years. The Nara Basin offered important advantages. Its fertile land could support agriculture. Its position allowed access to routes connecting different parts of the islands. It was close enough to the inland sea and western regions to benefit from contact with Korea and China, while also being protected by mountains and local geography. In such a place, A powerful ruling group could gather resources, command, labor, form alliances, and present itself as the center of a larger world. The most visible symbol of this age is the kofun, the great burial mounds built for elite leaders. Some were modest in size, while others were enormous earthworks shaped like keyholes when seen from above. These tombs gave their name to the Kofun period, which lasted roughly from the 3rd to the 6th century. A kofun was not simply a grave. It was a statement in the landscape. To build one required planning workers' food leadership and authority over a large community. Earth had to be moved. Shapes had to be formed. Moats and surrounding spaces had to be arranged. Grave goods had to be prepared and placed with the dead. The larger the mound, the more clearly it announced that the person buried within had commanded extraordinary respect and power. Imagine standing near one of these mounds in ancient Yamato. The land is quiet, but the shape of the tomb rises above the surrounding fields. It does not speak, yet it communicates. It tells everyone who passes that a great leader once lived here and that the people who built this monument were organized enough to transform the earth itself into a memory of power. Inside and around these tombs, archaeologists have found bronze mirrors, iron weapons, armor ornaments, and objects connected to both local craft and continental exchange. These grave goods show that Yamato elites were not isolated. They participated in networks that reached across the sea to Korea and China. From the continent came iron horse riding technology, administrative ideas, and skilled migrants who brought knowledge of metalwork, weaving, construction, and other crafts. The spread of Kofun-style burial mounds across different regions offers a clue to the expansion of Yamato influence. The earliest and largest examples appear in the Nara Basin, then similar tombs begin to appear elsewhere. Regional elites may have adopted this style to show loyalty, alliance, imitation, or participation in a shared political culture. In this way, burial became more than ritual. It became a form of political language. A local ruler who built a kofun was not only honoring the dead, he was placing himself within a wider order. He was showing that his authority belonged to the same world as the Yamato Center. Through tombs, rituals, marriages, tribute, and military cooperation, Yamato influence slowly extended outward. The political structure of early Yamato society was based on powerful clans known as Uji. Each clan had its own leader, its own ancestral traditions, and often its own protective deity, or kami. These clans were tied together through service hierarchy and ritual relationships. Below or alongside them were occupational groups sometimes known as B, who provided specialized labor as farmers, artisans, ritual workers, metal workers, or other service groups. The Yamato court did not yet govern like a later centralized bureaucracy. It did not have the fully developed administrative machinery that would come in later centuries. Power was still personal, clan-based, and tied to loyalty. A ruler's influence depended on the ability to command warriors, distribute prestige goods, arrange marriages, control ritual, and maintain the cooperation of powerful families. Religion played an essential role in this early political world. Clan leaders traced their origins to kami, or sacred beings, giving their authority a divine dimension. The Yamato ruling lineage eventually claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, a tradition that would become central to the later imperial institution. In this way, political power and sacred ancestry became closely linked. To rule was not only to command people, it was to stand between the human community and the divine order. Rituals, offerings, ancestral rites, and sacred stories helped bind communities together and gave legitimacy to those at the top. In a world where writing had not yet fully taken root in Japan, memory genealogy ceremony and visible symbols of power mattered deeply. The Yamato rulers also engaged with the wider East Asian world. Chinese records mention Japanese rulers and their envoys, while contact with Korean kingdoms brought new technologies and diplomatic relationships. Sometimes these relationships were cooperative, sometimes competitive. What matters is that Yamato was growing not in isolation, but as part of a larger regional system. Prestige could come from foreign objects, foreign recognition, and the ability to bring continental knowledge into the islands. Military organization became more visible as Yamato power expanded. Iron weapons armor, fortifications, and mounted warriors appear more frequently in the archaeological record. This suggests a world in which authority was not maintained through ritual alone. Leaders needed warriors. They needed the capacity to defend, pressure, punish, and reward. The early Japanese state was being formed through both sacred legitimacy and practical force. By the 5th century, Yamato had emerged as the strongest political center in Japan. It was not yet a fully unified nation in the modern sense. Many regional elites still held significant power, and administration remained tied to clan relationships rather than impersonal law. But the direction was clear. A dominant house had risen. Local leaders were being drawn into a broader hierarchy. Ritual, burial, diplomacy, and military strength were all helping to create a wider political order. The Kofun mounds remain the most powerful image of this transition. They rise from the earth as monuments to a time when Japan was moving from prehistory toward history. from villages and chiefdoms toward kings and courts. They do not give us speeches or written explanations, but their scale says enough. A society capable of building them had already crossed an important threshold. The Yamato Age stands between worlds. Behind it lies the long memory of Jomon forests and Yayoi rice fields. Ahead of it lie Buddhism, written chronicles, imperial capitals, court ceremonies, and the more recognizable shape of early Japanese civilization. In Yamato, we see the first outline of a state still young, still incomplete, but already powerful enough to bind people, land ritual, and ancestry into a lasting political vision. As night settles over this part of the story, we can imagine the ancient Nara Basin under a dark sky. Fields lie quiet. Clan leaders gather in wooden halls. Ritual fires burn. Envoys prepare to cross the sea. Somewhere in the distance, a great burial mound rises above the land, holding the remains of a ruler whose name may be lost, but whose power helped shape the future. The age of scattered villages was fading. The age of kings' courts and sacred lineages was beginning. And from this early Yamato world, the long imperial story of Japan would slowly unfold. The arrival of Buddhism, a new spiritual horizon. By the 6th century, the Yamato court had already begun to gather power around itself. Clan leaders served the ruling house, great burial mounds rose from the landscape, and Japan was increasingly connected to the kingdoms of Korea and the civilization of China. Through these connections came tools, craftsman ideas, and diplomatic customs. But among all the gifts and influences that crossed the sea, one would reshape the spiritual and cultural life of Japan more deeply than almost anything before it. This was Buddhism. Before Buddhism arrived, the people of Japan already lived in a world filled with sacred presence. Mountains, rivers, forests, unusual stones, ancient trees, storms, waterfalls, and ancestral spirits all had meaning. The later word Shinto would come to describe many of these native beliefs and rituals, but in this early period, they were not yet organized into a single formal religion. They were local, ancestral, and deeply tied to place. A clan might honor its own protective kami. A community might perform rituals for harvest purification, protection, or the dead. The sacred was not far away. It lived close to the people in the land around them and in the memory of those who came before. Then from the Asian continent came a very different kind of religious world. Buddhism brought images, scriptures, monks, temple architecture, philosophical ideas, and a vast vision of existence stretching across countless lives and realms. It spoke of suffering impermanence, karma, compassion, enlightenment, and release from the cycle of rebirth. For the Yamato court, this was not only a new faith, it was also a sign of cultural sophistication. Korea and China, the advanced civilizations with which Japan increasingly wished to engage, had already embraced Buddhism in powerful ways. To understand Buddhism was to step more fully into the world of East Asian diplomacy, learning, and prestige. The traditional date for the official introduction of Buddhism to Japan is 552 CE, although some evidence suggests that Buddhist objects and ideas may have arrived earlier through migrants and private contacts. According to the Nihon Shoki, the king of Baekje, one of the Korean kingdoms, sent an embassy to the Yamato court. The mission brought gifts that included an image of the Buddha's sacred texts and monks who could explain the new teaching. Imagine the scene at court. A statue, unlike anything familiar, is presented before the Japanese ruler and the gathered clans. It is not a local kami image. It does not belong to one mountain, one river, or one ancestral line. It carries with it the authority of a vast spiritual tradition already honored in kingdoms beyond the sea. To some at the court, it must have seemed beautiful and powerful. To others, it may have felt dangerous, foreign, and unsettling. The question was not simply whether the Buddha should be respected. The deeper question was what this new faith would mean for the existing order. If the court accepted Buddhism, would the old kami be angered? Would ancestral rituals lose their place? Would certain clans gain influence by controlling this new source of prestige? Religion and politics were not separate matters. The spiritual world helped justify earthly authority, and any change in ritual life could shift the balance of power among clans. The Soga clan became the strongest early supporter of Buddhism. They had close connections with the continent and saw the new religion as a source of prestige and political advantage. By promoting Buddhism, they could present themselves as open to advanced foreign culture and as patrons of a faith respected across East Asia. Opposing them were clans such as the Mononobe and Nakatomi, who were closely associated with traditional kami rituals and military or ceremonial functions. Their resistance came partly from genuine concern for the old gods and partly from fear that the Soga would gain too much influence. This conflict gave Buddhism's arrival a dramatic edge. It was not merely a quiet moment of spiritual curiosity. It became part of a struggle over the future of the Yamato state. Which tradition would guide the court? Which clans would stand closest to power? How would Japan absorb a foreign religion without breaking its own sacred foundations? Over time, the supporters of Buddhism prevailed. The Soga clan gained strength, and Buddhist worship became increasingly accepted at court. Temples were built, monks were supported, and the new religion began to take root, not as a replacement for native belief, but as an additional layer of meaning. One of the most important figures in this transformation was Prince Shotoku, who served as regent in the early 7th century. His image has become almost legendary in Japanese history. He was remembered as a statesman, a patron of Buddhism, and a reformer who looked toward the continent for models of government morality and culture. Prince Shotoku did not treat Buddhism only as private devotion. He saw in it a way to strengthen the moral and political order of the state. Under his patronage, temples were built and Buddhist learning was encouraged. The most famous temple associated with him is Horyuji near Nara, which would become one of the great monuments of early Japanese Buddhism. Its wooden halls, quiet courtyards, and sacred images still evoke the world of a court learning to express power through religion, architecture, and art. Buddhism also transformed Japanese visual culture. Before this, sacred objects in Japan were often tied to local ritual forms. With Buddhism came new images, seated Buddhas, bodhisattvas with serene expressions, guardian figures, lotus motifs, halos, temple layouts, pagodas, and painted walls. Craftsmen learned new techniques of bronze casting, wood carving, and architectural design. The temple became more than a place of worship. It was a center of learning, art, ritual medicine, and political display. Yet Buddhism did not embrace the older world of kami. Instead, the two traditions gradually learned to exist beside one another. At times, they were in tension, but often they blended. A mountain could be sacred in a native sense and also become a place for Buddhist practice. A kami could be honored near a Buddhist temple. Later, Japanese religious thought would develop ways to explain kami as local manifestations of Buddhist beings, allowing both traditions to share the same spiritual landscape. This ability to absorb and transform outside influence would become one of the enduring patterns of Japanese history. Buddhism came from abroad, but it did not remain foreign forever. It entered the Japanese world, changed it, and was changed by it. The faith that arrived through diplomacy became part of the island's own cultural language. For ordinary people, the early spread of Buddhism may have been slow and uneven. At first, it was mainly a religion of the court and powerful clans. Its texts were written in Chinese, its rituals required trained monks, and its temples depended on elite support. But even in this early stage, Buddhism introduced new ideas about suffering, death protection, merit, and the responsibilities of rulers. It gave the court a broader spiritual vocabulary and connected Japan to a civilization far larger than itself. The arrival of Buddhism marks one of the great turning points in Japanese history. The world of clan kami and ancestral ritual did not disappear, but it now shared space with an imported religion of temples, scriptures, images, and cosmic order. Japan's sacred landscape became wider. Its art became more complex. Its rulers gained a new source of legitimacy. Its relationship with Korea and China deepened. And as the new faith settled into the Yamato court, Japan moved closer to another transformation, the conscious building of a centralized state. The age of burial mounds and clan alliances was not yet over, but a different vision of rule was beginning to appear. It was a vision shaped by Buddhism, by Chinese models of government, by written law, and by the growing idea that the ruler should stand not merely as the head of one powerful lineage, but as the center of the realm itself. Asuka and the Taika reforms, building the early state. The 7th century brought Japan into a period of deliberate change. The court was still rooted in Yamato power clan relationships and sacred ancestry, but its leaders were increasingly aware of the organized states across the sea. China, especially under the Sui and Tang dynasties, offered a model of imperial rule written law, administrative order, and cultural prestige. Korea, too, remained a vital source of contact, knowledge, conflict, and exchange. In this age, Japan did not simply receive influence passively. Its rulers and reformers chose adapted and reshaped foreign models to suit the needs of the islands. They wanted a stronger court, a clearer hierarchy, and a political system that could reach beyond the old network of clans. The result was one of the most important reform movements in early Japanese history, the Taika reforms of 645 CE. The word Taika means great change, and the name fits the ambition of the period. The reforms followed a dramatic shift at court. The powerful Soga clan, which had long supported Buddhism and dominated politics, was overthrown by rivals allied with members of the imperial family. After this, Emperor Kotoku and his advisors, including Prince Nakano Oe, who would later become Emperor Tenji, announced a series of changes meant to strengthen the throne and reduce the independent power of great clans. To us, reforms can sound dry, like a list of rules written far from ordinary life. But in the 7th century, these changes were not merely paperwork. They altered the relationship between people, land, labor, and authority. They asked a basic question: did the land belong to local clan leaders, as it had in practice for generations, or did it belong to the ruler at the center of the realm? The answer given by the reforms was clear. All land and people were in principle placed under imperial authority. This was a radical idea. In earlier times, powerful families controlled land through custom inheritance, local strength, and clan tradition. By declaring the land to be the property of the state, the court claimed a new level of power. Land could now be measured, registered, redistributed, and taxed. People could be counted. Households could be recorded. Labor obligations could be assigned. The court was trying to turn a landscape of clan domains into a realm governed from the center. For a farmer in a distant village, the meaning of such reform would not have been abstract. It could mean fields being surveyed, names being entered into records, taxes being collected in rice cloth or labor, and officials arriving with authority that came not from a local lineage, but from the court. The state was no longer only a distant ritual presence. It was beginning to touch daily life. The reforms also reorganized local administration. Provinces and districts were defined more clearly, with officials appointed by the court to oversee them. This system was influenced by Chinese models, but it had to operate in Japanese conditions, where local families still held great influence and geography could make central control difficult. Mountains, islands, distance, and old loyalties did not vanish, simply because a reform was announced. Still, the symbolic importance of the Taika reforms was enormous. They declared that Japan was becoming a centralized imperial state. They placed the ruler above the clans. They gave the court a language of law and administration. Even where enforcement was uneven, the ideal had been set. Writing became increasingly important in this world. Chinese characters were used for official records, diplomacy, law, and learning. The Japanese language remained different from Chinese, but Chinese writing provided the tool through which the court could record names, taxes, ranks, documents, and histories. Literacy was still limited to elites, monks, and specialists, but its influence was growing. A state that writes can remember differently from a society that depends only on oral tradition. It can count, command, preserve, and claim continuity. Religion remained at the heart of political authority. Buddhism, now established at court, provided rituals for protection, legitimacy, and moral order. Temples were supported by rulers who saw them as guardians of the state. At the same time, native kami worship was not abandoned. Instead, the court increasingly drew local rituals under imperial patronage, linking older sacred traditions to the central authority of the ruler. The Asuka period, named after the region south of modern Nara, where the court was often located, became a landscape of temples, palaces, and new political ambition. Buildings inspired by continental styles appeared. Tiled roofs, Buddhist statues, pagodas, and planned palace compounds gave visible form to the court's desire for sophistication. Architecture became a way of saying that Japan was no longer only a land of clan halls and burial mounds. It was becoming a realm with institution ceremony and a broader cultural horizon. Diplomatic missions to China also played a crucial role. Japanese envoys traveled to the Sui and Tang courts, where they observed systems of government, urban planning law, Buddhism art, and court ceremony. They returned with books, ideas, and impressions of a vast imperial civilization. Japan would never become a copy of China, but the desire to learn from the continent shaped the direction of reform. The court also benefited from immigrants and descendants of immigrants from Korea and China. These communities brought skills in writing, metalwork, weaving, medicine, construction, and administration. Their contributions were essential to the formation of early Japanese statecraft. Behind the official names of emperors and princes were many lesser-known specialists whose knowledge helped transform the islands. The Taika reforms did not create a perfectly centralized government overnight. Local elites still mattered. Old clan interests survived. In many regions, the court's reach remained limited, but the reforms changed the imagination of power. They made it possible to think of Japan as a realm governed by a central ruler, organized through provinces supported by taxes and legitimized by both native sacred ancestry and imported Buddhist protection. This period also prepared the way for Japan's first permanent capitals. If the state was to be centralized, it needed more than laws. It needed a physical center, a place where the ruler officials' temples, archives, and rituals could gather. Earlier courts had moved frequently, partly because of political custom and partly because death and ritual pollution made palace sites temporary. But as Japan adopted continental models of rule, the idea of a stable capital became more attractive. The Asuka and Taika reforms therefore stand at a threshold. Behind them lies the older world of clans and sacred lineages. Ahead of them lies the age of planned capitals, written history's great temples, and a court that increasingly saw itself as the heart of a civilized realm. In the quiet of this transformation, we can imagine officials unrolling records, monks chanting in newly built temples, craftsmen placing tiles on wooden roofs, and farmers in distant villages noticing that the reach of the court had grown a little longer. The change was not always smooth, and it was not equally felt everywhere, but Japan was learning to govern itself in a new way. The state was no longer only being inherited, it was being built. Nara, the first permanent capital and the memory of a nation. In the year 710, the Japanese court established a new capital at Heijō-kyo, in the area we now know as Nara. This marked the beginning of the Nara period, which lasted until 794. For the first time in Japanese history, the court settled into a permanent capital on a grand scale planned according to continental models and designed to express the power of the state. Before this, the court had often moved from one palace site to another. Each reign or political shift could bring a relocation, and older ideas about ritual purity made it difficult for a ruler to remain in a place associated with death. permanent capital represented a different vision. It suggested that the state was mature enough to anchor itself in space to build offices, temples, roads, markets, and residences around a stable center. Heijokyo was modeled in part on Chang'an, the great capital of Tang China. Its streets were laid out in a grid. A broad central avenue led toward the imperial palace. Government offices, aristocratic residences, markets, and temples occupied planned spaces within the city. To enter this capital was to step into an organized vision of rule. The city itself became a map of authority. Imagine arriving near Nara in the 8th century. Beyond the fields and low hills, a planned city appears more orderly than the older settlements of previous ages. Roads run straight. Officials move between offices. Monks pass through temple gates. Messengers carry documents. Artisans work on statues, tiles, lacquer, and metal fittings. The air carries the sounds of bells, carts, animals chanting, and human activity. Japan's early state has taken visible form. The Nara court continued to operate under the Ritsuryo system, a set of legal and administrative codes influenced by Chinese models. In theory, the emperor stood at the center of a bureaucratic state. Officials governed provinces, censuses recorded households, taxes were collected, and laws defined duties and ranks. In practice, the system faced many difficulties, especially in distant regions, but the ideal of centralized rule remained powerful. Buddhism reached new heights during the Nara period. It was not only a religion of personal faith or aristocratic devotion. It became a major instrument of state protection. Emperors sponsored temples and rituals in the hope that Buddhism would guard the realm from disaster, rebellion, illness, and disorder. The state and the Buddhist establishment grew closely intertwined. The greatest symbol of this union was Todai-ji, the great temple commissioned by Emperor Shomu in the mid-8th century. Within its vast wooden hall stood the great Buddha, a bronze image of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha, towering over those who entered. The casting of this statue required immense resources, labor, mental planning, and devotion. It was a religious act, but also a political one. It announced that the ruler could mobilize the entire realm in service of sacred protection. Picture the great Buddha in the dim interior of the hall. The air is cool. The smell of wood and incense lingers. Light falls softly across bronze. For a person standing below the statue must have seemed almost beyond human scale, a presence larger than ordinary life. In that moment, Buddhism, art, labor, and imperial power came together in one overwhelming image. The Nara state also established provincial temples through the Kokubunji system. Each province was expected to support a monastery and a nunnery under state patronage. This extended Buddhist protection across the country and reinforced the court's authority. Temples became centers of ritual learning, record-keeping, and economic power. Monks were not only religious figures, they were literate specialists, advisors, and participants in the life of the state. Native Khmer worship continued alongside Buddhism. The court did not treat the older tradition as something to discard. Major shrines were recognized and their rituals incorporated into state ceremony. Over time, Buddhist and Khmer practices became increasingly interwoven. This blending of traditions would become a defining feature of Japanese religious life. The Nara period was also the age in which Japan began to write down its own memory. The Kojiki, or Records of Ancient Matters, was compiled in 712. The Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, was completed in 720. These works preserved myths, genealogies, songs, and accounts of early rulers. They traced the imperial line back to divine origins, especially to the sun goddess Amaterasu, and helped establish a sacred foundation for the authority of the court. Written history is never only a record of the past, it is also a statement about the present. By compiling these texts, the Nara court was saying that Japan had an ordered past, a divine lineage, and a rightful center of authority. Myth and politics came together on the page. Oral traditions that had once lived in recitation and memory were now shaped into official chronicles. Literature also flourished in another form. The Man Yoshu, compiled in the late 8th century, became the first great anthology of Japanese poetry. Its poems were written using Chinese characters to represent Japanese sounds and meanings, revealing the creative struggle to adapt imported writing to the Japanese language. The collection includes poems by emperors, nobles, soldiers, frontier guards, and ordinary people. Its themes range from love and longing to travel grief, nature loyalty, and the ache of separation. This is one of the gentle treasures of the Nara age. In a period often remembered for state-building and monumental Buddhism, the Man Yoshu preserves personal voices. A person missing someone far away, a traveler looking at the moon, a guard posted at the edge of the realm, a lover waiting for a message. These poems remind us that history is not only built from laws and temples, but also from the inner lives of people who felt the same loneliness, hope, tenderness, and sorrow that people feel now. Yet the Nara period also carried tensions beneath its achievements. Buddhist institutions grew wealthy and influential. Temples accumulated land and resources. Powerful monks could become involved in politics sometimes too deeply. or the comfort of the court. The very religion that helped legitimize the state could also challenge it. Economic difficulties also emerged. The land redistribution system did not function as smoothly over time. Wealthy families and religious institutions found ways to secure exemptions and accumulate private holdings. The gap between the ideal of centralized control and the reality of local power widened. These problems would continue into later centuries and gradually weaken the court's ability to command resources. By the late 8th century, the court began to seek a new beginning. The influence of Nara's great temples had become too strong, and political tensions made the capital feel burdened by its own institutions. In 784, the capital was moved briefly to Nagaoka-kyo. Then, in 794, it moved again to Heian-kyo, the city that would later be called Kyoto. The Nara period was relatively short, but its importance is immense. It gave Japan its first great permanent capital. It produced monumental Buddhist art. It created written histories that shaped the legitimacy of the imperial line. It preserved early Japanese poetry. It showed both the promise and the difficulty of building a centralized state. As we leave, Nara imagined the old capital at evening. Temple bells sound over wooden roofs. Monks move through courtyards. Officials close their records for the day. Somewhere, a poem is being composed by lamplight, while beyond the city, farmers continue the work that sustains the realm. Nara was not the final form of early Japan. It was a beginning, made visible in streets, temples, bronze, ink, and memory. Heian, the quiet beauty of the court. In 794, the Japanese court moved to a new capital called Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. In time, this city would become known as Kyoto, and for more than 1,000 years, it would remain one of the great cultural hearts of Japan. The move marked the beginning of the Heian period, an age that lasted until 1185 and produced some of the most refined and enduring achievements in Japanese art, literature, religion, and courtly life. The decision to leave Nara was partly political. The court wanted distance from the powerful Buddhist institutions that had grown around the old capital. By building a new city, the emperor and aristocracy hoped to renew the state in a place less dominated by entrenched temple interests. Like Nara before it, Heian-kyo was planned according to continental models, with broad avenues, a rectangular grid, and the imperial palace placed at the northern end of the central axis. But over time, Heian became something more distinctively Japanese. The influence of China remained important, especially in government writing and religion, but Japan began to transform what it had borrowed into its own cultural forms. The court developed a world of extraordinary elegance where rank poetry, clothing, handwriting, scent, music, architecture, and emotional sensitivity all mattered deeply. To imagine high-end court life, we should not begin with a battlefield or a council chamber. We should begin with a quiet room inside a wooden residence where screens divide the space curtains, soften the light, and the scent of incense lingers in the air. Outside, a garden is arranged with waterstones, plants, and carefully framed views. A courtier listens to rain falling on the roof. A letter arrives, written in graceful calligraphy, accompanied by a poem. The words are few, but every choice matters: the paper, the brushwork, the seasonal reference, the emotional restraint, the timing of the reply. In the Heian aristocratic world, beauty was a form of social intelligence. A person of rank was expected to understand poetry, music, color combinations, ceremony, and the subtle language of feeling. A badly chosen poem could embarrass someone. A graceful response could win admiration. The court was small and closed and highly sensitive to reputation. People watched one another carefully, not only in matters of politics, but in matters of taste. Power during the Heian period was increasingly dominated by the Fujiwara clan. Rather than seizing the throne directly, the Fujiwara gained influence through marriage politics. They married their daughters into the imperial family, became maternal relatives of emperors, and served as regents for young rulers. Through this strategy, they stood behind the throne while preserving the sacred status of the imperial line. The emperor remained the symbolic center of the state, but the daily reality of politics often belonged to powerful aristocratic families. Rank determined much of life at court. Official positions, clothing colors, access to ceremonies, and even the scale of a residence reflected status. The court was a world of ritualized hierarchy, where everyone knew their place and where small gestures could carry political meaning. At the same time, the formal administrative system inherited from earlier reforms began to weaken. The Ritsuryo state still existed in theory, but its practical control over the provinces declined. Private estates known as shuin expanded, often controlled by aristocrats, temples, or powerful families. Many of these estates gained tax exemptions and became difficult for the central government to manage. While court life in Kyoto became more refined, the countryside was gradually moving in a different direction. For now, though, let us stay inside the Heian court because its cultural achievements are among the most beautiful in Japanese history. The greatest literary masterpiece of the age is The Tale of Genji, written in the early 11th century by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at court. Often called the world's first novel, it follows the life, love, sorrows, ambitions, and disappointments of Prince Genji and those around him. What makes the work remarkable is not simply its plot, but its sensitivity to emotion. It captures the passing nature of beauty, the pain of attachment, the fragility of reputation, and the quiet sadness that lies beneath elegant surfaces. The tale of Genji belongs to a world where a moonlit visit, a poem sent after dawn, the color of a robe, or the sound of someone weeping behind a screen can carry enormous emotional weight. It is not a loud work. Its power lies in atmosphere observation and the awareness that everything beautiful is also temporary. Another brilliant voice of the period was Sei Shonagon, author of The Pillow Book. Her work is a collection of observations, lists, memories, judgments, and scenes from court life. She writes about things that are elegant, irritating, charming, embarrassing, or delightful. Through her eyes, the Heian court becomes vivid in immediate festivals, gossip, snowfall, awkward visitors, beautiful letters, and the small pleasures and annoyances of aristocratic life. One of the reasons Heian literature is so important is the role of women writers. While men often wrote official documents in Chinese-style poetry, women at court helped develop literary expression in Japanese. The kana syllabary, which allowed Japanese to be written more naturally than with Chinese characters alone, opened new possibilities for diaries, poetry, fiction, and personal reflection. Through this writing, the inner world of the court became part of Japan's lasting cultural memory. Poetry was central to Heian life. The short waka poem, usually arranged in a pattern of 31 syllables, became the preferred form of emotional expression. Poems were exchanged between lovers, friends, rivals, and officials. They marked seasons, ceremonies, departures, longing, and grief. A poem did not need to explain everything. It only needed to suggest enough for the listener or reader to feel what was hidden beneath the words. This is where the Heian sensibility of mono no aware becomes especially important. The phrase is often translated as an awareness of impermanence or the pathos of things. It refers to the gentle sadness that arises when we recognize that beauty cannot last. Cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall. Autumn leaves move us because they are already fading. A love affair is intense because it is uncertain. A life is precious because it passes. The Heian court gave this feeling a delicate language. It found meaning in mist, moonlight, rain, seasonal change, and memory. It did not deny sorrow. It refined sorrow into art. Religion during the Heian period also developed in important ways. Buddhism remained powerful, but new schools gained prominence. Tendai Buddhism, established on Mount Hiei by Saisho, and Shingon Buddhism, brought by Kukai and centered on Mount Koya, introduced forms of esoteric practice involving ritual mandalas, mantras, and complex visions of the cosmos. These mountain monasteries became major centers of learning, spiritual practice, and eventually political power. Court aristocrats often turned to Buddhism for protection, healing, merit, and preparation for death. Rituals were performed to guard the state, cure illness, ensure safe childbirth, or help the dead. At the same time, kami worship remained woven into religious life. The sacred landscape of Japan continued to hold both Buddhist and native meanings. A temple, a shrine, a mountain, and a ritual could belong to overlapping worlds. Heian architecture reflected the aesthetic of the court. Aristocratic residences were often built in the Shindenzukuri style, with open wooden halls connecting corridors, gardens, ponds, and carefully arranged views. These spaces were designed not only for shelter, but for ceremony, poetry, music, and contemplation. A garden was not merely decoration. It was part of how aristocrats experienced the seasons and composed their emotions. Yet the beauty of Heian was fragile. Beyond Kyoto, provincial society was changing. The growth of private estates weakened state control. Local landholders needed protection. Armed men were increasingly employed to guard property, collect revenues, and settle disputes. These warriors were not yet the rulers of Japan, but their importance was growing. In the provinces, far from the perfume and poetry of the capital, a different social order was taking shape. This contrast gives the Heian period its quiet tension. At the center, the court cultivated elegance to an extraordinary degree. On the edges, the foundations of warrior power were slowly forming. Kyoto looked inward, refining its language of beauty, while the provinces looked toward land, weapons, loyalty, and defense. The Heian period is therefore both a golden age and a prelude. It gave Japan some of its most enduring cultural ideals: sensitivity to nature, the beauty of suggestion, the power of poetry, the emotional depth of impermanence, and the refined world of courtly aesthetics. But it also revealed the weakness of aristocratic rule and prepared the way for the rise of the samurai. As we leave the early and middle Heian court, let the image become quiet again. A lamp burns low behind a screen. Outside, rain darkens the garden stones. Somewhere in the capital, a poem is being written in careful script. Somewhere farther away in a province beyond the mountains, a mounted warrior checks his bow and listens to the night. For a time, these two worlds still belonged to the same Japan, but they were beginning to move in different directions. And from that slow separation, the next great age of Japanese history would begin. The weakening of Heian and the rise of the samurai. The Heian court was a world of poetry, ceremony, fragrance, and carefully measured beauty. Within Kyoto, aristocrats still composed verses beneath the moon, exchanged elegant letters, and arranged their lives around rank, taste, and ritual. Yet beyond the capital and the wide provinces of Japan, another world was growing. It did not grow in silence, but it grew far from the polished corridors of the court. The old system of centralized government had begun to weaken. The laws and administrative structures inherited from earlier reforms still existed in theory, but the court could no longer control the countryside with the same confidence. Private estates known as shuin expanded across the provinces. These estates were often owned or protected by powerful aristocratic families, temples, shrines, or members of the imperial family. Many received exemptions from taxation and interference by government officials, which gradually reduced the court's direct authority over land and revenue. For the people who lived on these estates, power was becoming more local. The emperor remained sacred, and Kyoto remained the symbolic center of the realm, but daily life was increasingly shaped by estate managers, local landholders, and armed retainers. Fields still had to be cultivated. Taxes or rents still had to be collected. Boundaries still had to be defended. When disputes arose, distant officials in the capital were often too slow, too weak, or too removed to settle them effectively. Out of this need for local protection, the warrior class began to rise. At first, these warriors were not the romantic figures later imagined in stories and paintings. They were practical men tied to land service and local authority. Some were descendants of provincial officials. Others came from powerful local families. Many served aristocrats or religious institutions as guards, tax collectors, estate managers, or enforcers. Their skill was not in courtly poetry, but in riding, archery, swordsmanship, discipline, and the ability to command men in times of conflict. The word samurai originally carried the sense of service. A samurai was someone who served a lord. Over time, however, this service became more than a duty. It became a social identity. Families passed down military skills from one generation to the next. A warrior's reputation could rest on loyalty, courage, land rights, and the ability to protect what had been entrusted to him. The contrast with Kyoto was striking. In the capital, a person's rank might be recognized through robe colors, titles, poetry, and ceremonial access. In the provinces, reputation increasingly depended on whether a man could defend an estate, lead mounted archers, suppress disorder, and maintain loyalty among followers. Both worlds had their own codes of honor, but they were not the same. One valued refinement and sensitivity. The other valued resolve, endurance, and readiness for violence when order broke down. The court did not immediately see these warriors as rivals. In fact, it came to rely on them. When rebellions or local disturbances erupted, the central government often called upon provincial military families to restore order. Success brought rewards, titles, land rights, recognition, and greater prestige. Each time the court depended on warriors, it strengthened the very class that would one day overshadow it. By the 10th and 11th centuries, warrior lineages had become increasingly important. Among the most powerful were the Taira and Minamoto families. Both claimed imperial descent, which gave them aristocratic legitimacy, but their strength came from military networks in the provinces. They stood between two worlds, close enough to the court to participate in high politics, yet rooted deeply enough in the countryside to command real armed power. The rise of these warrior clans did not mean that high-end culture suddenly disappeared. Court life continued. Poetry continued. The rituals of Kyoto remained beautiful and elaborate, but beneath that surface, the balance of power was shifting. The aristocracy still possessed status, but warriors increasingly possessed force. This slow transformation is one of the most important in Japanese history. It was not a simple replacement of one class by another. For a long time, nobles and warriors depended on each other. Aristocrats needed military protection. Warriors needed titles, legitimacy, and access to courtly authority. The new order grew through service, marriage, rivalry, ambition, and the practical demands of governing a country whose center could no longer command every region directly. Daily life for early samurai was disciplined and local. A warrior might live on or near the estate he served, surrounded by family retainers, horses, weapons, fields, and obligations. He trained in archery and riding, maintained armor and equipment, settled disputes, answered calls to service, and guarded the interests of his lord. His world was still connected to farming and land because land was the basis of wealth. To defend land was to defend survival status and the future of one's family. As these men became more organized, a new kind of loyalty began to matter. Personal bonds between lord and retainer grew stronger. Service could be rewarded with land privilege or protection. These relationships would eventually form the foundation of Japan's feudal order. Long before the word Bushido was shaped into a later ideal, the practical habits of warrior life were already forming loyalty, martial skill, family honor, endurance, and the acceptance that life could change suddenly. The Heian court, for all its elegance, could not stop this change. Its beauty remained powerful, but its political reach was narrowing. The great poems and novels of Kyoto captured the fleeting nature of love and beauty, while beyond the capital, another kind of impermanence was being prepared: the rise and fall of houses through war. By the late Heian period, the Taira and Minamoto had become central players in national politics. Court disputes increasingly required military backing. Questions of succession, regency, land, and influence could no longer be settled by ceremony alone. Armed families were now drawn into the struggles of the aristocracy, and once warriors entered the heart of political life, they would not easily leave. The world of Heian was beginning to divide. Kyoto still glowed with lamps, music letters, and moonlit gardens. But in the provinces, bows were being strung, horses were being trained, and families of warriors were learning that power belonged not only to those who stood nearest the throne, but also to those who could defend, command, and endure. From that quiet but steady change, the age of the samurai began. The Genpei wore the fall of the Taira and the rise of the Minamoto. By the 12th century, the rivalry between the Taira and Minamoto clans had become one of the defining struggles of Japan. Both families had risen through service to the court. Both possessed military strength, provincial networks, and claims to aristocratic legitimacy. For a time, their power was used within the framework of court politics. But as the authority of the old aristocracy weakened, the rivalry between these warrior houses moved closer to open war. The Taira reached the height of their influence under Taira no Kiyomori. He was a skilled military leader and a shrewd political figure who understood that power in Japan still needed the appearance of courtly legitimacy. After conflicts in the mid-12th century, including the Hogan Rebellion of 1156 and the Heiji Rebellion of 1159, Kiyomori emerged as the dominant warrior at court. He placed relatives in important positions, arranged marriages with the imperial family, and brought the Taira into the center of Kyoto politics. For a moment, it seemed that the Taira had mastered both worlds. They held military power, but also moved through the refined spaces of the court. Their children married into elite families. Their influence touched decisions of succession and rank. Kiyomori even managed to place his infant grandson on the throne as Emperor Antoku. This was an extraordinary achievement, but it also created resentment. Many aristocrats disliked the Taira's dominance. Rival warriors saw opportunity. The Minamoto, though weakened, had not disappeared. In 1180, Prince Mochihito issued a call to arms against Taira rule. The appeal did not immediately overthrow the Taira, but it gave their enemies a banner under which to gather. The Genpei War had begun. The conflict would last 5 years, from 1180 to 1185. It was not a single battle, but a long and shifting civil war fought across different regions through alliances, retreats, sudden attacks, and moments that later generations would remember in literature, theater, and legend. At the center of the Minamoto cause stood Minamoto no Yoritomo, who established his base in Kamakura in eastern Japan. Far from the courtly world of Kyoto, Kamakura offered distant security and access to the warrior networks of the East. Yoritomo was not alone. His half-brothers Minamoto no Yoshitsune and Minamoto no Noriyori became important commanders. Yoshitsune in particular would become one of the most celebrated figures in Japanese memory, brilliant daring, and ultimately tragic. His military actions helped bring the Minamoto to victory, but his later conflict with Yoritomo would show how dangerous success could be within a warrior family. The early battles of the Genpei War revealed the changing nature of power. At the Battle of Uji in 1180, Minamoto forces attempted to resist the Taira near a bridge leading to the Byodo-in temple. The Minamoto were defeated, but the battle became part of the larger story of resistance. It showed that the conflict would not remain a matter of court intrigue. Warriors' temples, imperial claimants, and provincial alliances were now drawn into the struggle. For several years, the war moved unevenly. The Taira still controlled the capital and held great resources, but their position became more difficult as Minamoto support grew. Yoritomo built his strength in the east, with patience gathering retainers who saw in him the possibility of a new order. These warriors were not merely fighting for a noble cause in the abstract. They were fighting for recognition, land protection, and a future in which provincial military families would no longer remain subordinate to the unstable politics of Kyoto. One of the most dramatic Minamoto victories came at Ichi no Tani in 1184. The Taira had established a strong position near present-day Kobe, protected by the sea on one side and steep slopes on the other. Yoshitsune led a daring attack from the mountains, descending unexpectedly on the Taira position. Later accounts turned this assault into one of the great scenes of medieval Japanese warfare. Banners above the cliff's horses moving down dangerous slopes, defenders caught by surprise, and the Taira forced to abandon another stronghold. The war continued westward. The Taira retreated toward the inland sea, carrying with them the young emperor Antoku and the sacred imperial regalia. Their cause became increasingly desperate, yet still symbolically powerful. They had lost ground, but they still held the child emperor, and with him acclaimed a legitimacy that could not be ignored. The final confrontation came in 1185 at the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, a naval battle in the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The setting itself gives the event a haunting quality. Instead of a field of dust and trampled grass, the fate of the Taira unfolded on moving water, beneath shifting winds and changing tides. At first, the tide favored the Taira. Their knowledge of the currents gave them an advantage, and the battle did not immediately belong to the Minamoto. But as the water shifted and defections weakened the Taira position, the Minamoto fleet gained the upper hand. Arrows crossed the air between boats. Warriors fought at close range. The sea, which had carried armies and ambitions, now became the place where a great family reached its end. The fall of the Taira at Dan no Ura became one of the most tragic images in Japanese history. As defeat became inevitable, many members of the Taira chose death in the water rather than capture. Among them was the young Emperor Antoku, still a child. His grandmother, according to later tradition, carried him into the sea along with the sacred regalia. Whether every detail of the story can be treated as literal fact is less important than what it came to mean. The fall of the Taira became a lesson in impermanence, the Buddhist truth that even the proudest houses cannot escape change. The Genpei War ended with Minamoto victory. The Heian aristocratic order, though not erased, had been permanently altered. The court remained in Kyoto. The emperor remained sacred. Rituals, titles, and traditions continued. But real political authority now belonged increasingly to warriors, and among them, Yoritomo stood above the rest. Rather than ruling from Kyoto, Yoritomo remained in Kamakura. This choice mattered deeply. It showed that the new military order would not simply become another faction within the old capital. It would create its own center, its own institutions, and its own relationship with the emperor. In 1192, Yoritomo was formally appointed shogun, giving official recognition to a reality already created by force, loyalty, and victory. The Genpei War was therefore both an ending and a beginning. It ended the dominance of the Taira. It ended the long political supremacy of the Heian aristocratic world. It began the age of military government in which the samurai would no longer serve merely as provincial enforcers, but as the ruling class of Japan. Later generations preserved the memory of the war in the Tale of the Heike, one of the great works of Japanese literature. Its mood is deeply shaped by impermanence. Bells ring, proud families fall, beauty fades, and power passes from one hand to another. This was not only history as victory and defeat, it was history as sorrow, memory, and warning. As the waters of Dan no Ura grew quiet again, Japan had crossed into a new age. The courtly lamps of Heian still burned in Kyoto, but the future now belonged to Kamakura, to warrior houses, and to the samurai who had learned that land loyalty and military service could remake the realm. Kamakura, the first warrior government. The establishment of the Kamakura shogunate marked one of the great turning points in Japanese history. For the first time, political power rested firmly in the hands of a military government led by the samurai. The emperor and court aristocracy remained in Kyoto, preserving sacred authority, court ritual, and cultural prestige. But the practical machinery of rule had shifted eastward to Kamakura. Minamoto no Yoritomo understood the importance of legitimacy. He did not abolish the imperial court. He did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he allowed the old symbols of authority to remain while building a new system beneath them. The emperor gave titles. Kyoto preserved ritual. Kamakura commanded warriors, appointed officials, settled disputes, and managed the network of loyalty that held the samurai class together. This dual structure gave medieval Japan its distinctive shape. There was an imperial court, ancient and sacred, and there was a military government, practical and powerful. These two centers did not always agree, but they depended on each other. The court needed the shogunate's military strength. The shogunate needed the court's formal recognition. Yoritomo's government relied on the loyalty of warrior retainers. These men expected reward in exchange for service, and land rights were the most important form of reward. To manage the provinces, the shogunate appointed officials known as Shugo and Jito. The Shugo served as military governors, responsible for maintaining order and overseeing samurai in the provinces. The Jito acted as estate stewards, managing lands, collecting revenues, and protecting the interests of the shogunate and its vassals. These offices tied distant estates and provinces to Kamakura. They also helped formalize the place of the samurai within government. A warrior was no longer only a local strongman or hired guard. He could now hold recognized authority under the shogunate. His service had a legal and political framework. The Kamakura period did not create peace in a simple or complete sense, but it did create a more stable warrior order. Disputes over land and inheritance were common, and the shogunate needed rules to manage them. In 1232, under the Hojo regent Hojo Yasutoki, the Gosei by Shikimoku was issued. This legal code was designed for the practical concerns of samurai society. It dealt with land claims, inheritance, vassal obligations, and the settlement of disputes. Unlike earlier law codes modeled heavily on Chinese bureaucratic ideals, the Gosei by Shikimoku reflected the realities of warrior life. It was not concerned with creating a perfect Confucian state. It was concerned with fairness, precedent, service, and property. Its importance lies in the way it gave structure to a society based on personal loyalty and landholding. After Yoritomo's death in 1199, the Minamoto line did not maintain direct power for long. His widow, Hojo Masako, and her family became central to the government. The Hojo clan established the position of shikin or regent, ruling in the name of the shogun. Over time, the shoguns themselves often became figureheads, while the Hojo regents held real authority. This may sound unusual, but it fit a recurring pattern in Japanese history. Power often worked through layers. The emperor could be sacred while others governed in his name. The shogun could hold military title while a regent governed in his name. Authority did not always sit openly in one pair of hands. It moved through symbols, offices, family relationships, and carefully preserved forms. Kamakura society also saw important religious changes. Earlier, Buddhism had often been closely tied to the court and elite institutions, but during the Kamakura period, new forms of Buddhism spread more broadly among warriors and common people. These schools responded to the anxieties of an age marked by warfare, social change, and a widespread feeling that the world had entered a period of decline. Pure Land Buddhism offered hope through devotion to Amida Buddha and recitation of the Nembutsu. It was accessible, emotional, and comforting to many people who could not devote themselves to complex temple rituals or scholarly study. Nichiren Buddhism, founded by the monk Nichiren, emphasized devotion to the Lotus Sutra with passionate intensity. Zen Buddhism, introduced from China, appealed especially to members of the warrior class through its discipline, meditation, austerity, and directness. The spread of these Buddhist movements gave the Kamakura period a strong spiritual character. While warriors organized, land and law monks and teachers offered new paths for salvation, focus, and meaning. In a society where death could arrive suddenly, religious teachings about impermanence, rebirth, and enlightenment carried great emotional force. Kamakura itself was different from Kyoto. Kyoto was an old capital of courtly refinement, wide avenues, aristocratic mansions, and inherited ceremony. Kamakura was more compact, more military, and more closely tied to the world of warriors. Surrounded by hills and facing the sea, it was defensible and practical. Its location reflected the character of the new regime, separate from the old court, grounded in the East, and built around the needs of military rule. For ordinary samurai, the Kamakura order brought both opportunity and obligation. A retainer could gain land rights, legal recognition, and status through service. But he also owed loyalty, military duty, and readiness to answer the shogunate's call. His life was bound to family, lord land, and reputation. The bonds between warrior and superior grew stronger and more formal, laying foundations for later feudal relationships. Economically, Japan continued to develop. Agriculture expanded in many areas. Trade with Song China brought ceramics, coins, books, and other goods. Markets grew, and coastal exchange became increasingly important. Although the samurai were the ruling class, merchants, artisans, farmers, monks, and estate managers all contributed to the changing life of medieval Japan. The Kamakura shogunate endured for more than a century, and its importance lies not only in its institutions, but in the precedent it set. It showed that Japan could be ruled by a military government while preserving the emperor as a sacred symbol. It made the samurai central to politics. It developed legal traditions suited to warrior society. It gave shape to the dual structure of court and shogunate that would define much of Japan's medieval history. Yet, even as Kamakura stabilized warrior rule, it contained weaknesses. The system depended on rewarding service with land and rights. When warriors served and received nothing in return, dissatisfaction could grow. This problem would become especially serious during the greatest external crisis of the Kamakura age, the attempted invasions by the Mongol Empire. For now, though, let us imagine Kamakura in the stillness of evening. The sea lies dark beyond the town. In the hills, temples and warrior residences settle into shadow. A messenger rides through a narrow road. Somewhere a monk chants. Somewhere else a samurai checks the bindings of his armor, not for ceremony, but because service may be demanded at any time. The age of the court had not ended completely. But Japan was now living under the shadow and discipline of the warrior government. The Mongol invasions, the divine wind, and the cost of victory. In the 13th century, Japan faced a danger unlike anything in its history. Across the sea, the Mongol Empire had created one of the largest land empires the world had ever known. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies had swept across Eurasia, conquering kingdoms, breaking cities, and reshaping the political map from China to Eastern Europe. By the time Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in China, the Mongols had already become a force that few rulers could ignore. Japan, ruled by the Kamakura shogunate under the Hojo regents, stood beyond the sea, but not beyond Mongol ambition. In 1266, Kublai Khan sent envoys demanding that Japan recognize Yuan supremacy and send tribute. For the Mongols, such demands were a familiar part of imperial diplomacy. Submission from surrounding states confirmed their authority and reduced the need for war. But to the Kamakura government, the demand was unacceptable. Japan had no intention of becoming a tributary of the Yuan. Later, envoys arrived with similar messages, and the shogunate continued to refuse. The air between Japan and the continent grew tense. For the samurai, the threat was both distant and immediate. Many had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. Japanese warfare had been shaped by local conflicts, mounted archery, personal bravery, and the codes of warrior reputation. The Mongol armies, by contrast, were known for coordination, discipline, mass tactics, and the use of technologies and strategies drawn from across their vast empire. The first invasion came in 1274. A fleet carrying Mongol, Chinese, and Korean forces crossed from Korea toward northern Kyushu. They landed near Hakata Bay in the area of present-day Fukuoka. The defenders were samurai of the Kamakura order called to protect the coast from an enemy whose methods differed sharply from their own. The fighting shocked the Japanese. Mongol forces used coordinated infantry movements, massed archery, and explosive projectiles that produced noise and confusion. The samurai fought fiercely, but they were facing a style of warfare less focused on individual challenge and more on collective pressure. The battlefield had widened beyond familiar rules. Even so, the Mongol army did not secure a lasting foothold. After heavy fighting near the shore, the invaders withdrew to their ships. During the night, a storm struck the fleet, damaging vessels and forcing a retreat. Japan had survived the first invasion. But no one could assume the danger was over. The Kamakura shogunate responded with urgency. Defenses were strengthened along Hakata Bay. Stone walls were built to make future landings more difficult. Warriors from across Japan were mobilized and stationed in Kyushu. The coast became a place of waiting. Years passed under the expectation that the Mongols would return, and this long state of readiness placed great strain on the samurai and the government. The second invasion came in 1281, and it was much larger. Kublai Khan sent two fleets, one from Korea and another from southern China. Together, they carried a vast force intended to overwhelm Japan by numbers, planning, and imperial power. The scale of the operation was enormous for its time, and if it had succeeded, the history of Japan would have changed completely. This time, however, the Japanese were better prepared. The stone walls at Hakata Bay made landing more difficult. Samurai launched night raids in small boats, attacking enemy ships and disrupting supplies. The defenders could not easily destroy the Mongol force outright, but they could harass it, delay it, and prevent it from gaining secure control on land. The struggle dragged on. Ships crowded the waters. Soldiers waited in heat, uncertainty, and disease. The sea, which had once carried migrants, monks, traders, and ideas to Japan, now carried one of the greatest threats the islands had ever faced. Then, in August, a massive typhoon struck. The storm scattered and wrecked much of the Mongol fleet. Ships were smashed, soldiers drowned, and the invasion collapsed. Survivors retreated, and Japan remained unconquered. Later generations remembered the storm as the kamikaze, the divine wind, a force sent by the gods to protect the islands. The idea of the divine wind became deeply rooted in Japanese memory. It suggested that Japan was guarded not only by warriors' walls and strategy, but by sacred forces. In the story that the nation told about itself, the storm became more than weather. It became protection destiny and proof that the islands stood under divine care. Yet the victory carried a hidden cost. The samurai had fought guarded built defenses and remained mobilized for years. They expected rewards. In ordinary warfare, a victorious lord could distribute captured land to loyal followers. But the Mongol invasions produced no conquered territory. There were no new estates in China or Korea to hand out. There was no defeated local enemy whose lands could be reassigned. The shogunate had saved Japan, but it had little material reward to offer the men who had defended it. This created dissatisfaction. Many warriors had spent resources and time answering the call to service. Some fell into debt. Others felt that their loyalty had not been properly recognized. The Kamakura system depended on the bond between service and reward. When that bond weakened, the authority of the shogunate weakened with it. The cost of coastal defense continued even after the invasions ended. The shogunate could not know for certain that the Mongols would never return. Warriors remained on alert, and resources were spent maintaining readiness. What had begun as a moment of national survival became a long burden on the political order. The Mongol invasions also changed the way Japan imagined itself in relation to the outside world. Until this time, foreign influence had often come through selective borrowing, Buddhism, writing, art, technology, and diplomacy. The Mongol threat was different. It was not a gift, a teaching, or an exchange. It was the possibility of conquest. Japan's survival reinforced a sense of distinctiveness and divine protection, but it also exposed the vulnerability of an island country to forces beyond the sea. Culturally, the invasions became part of the heroic memory of the samurai. Scrolls, stories, and later accounts celebrated warriors who rode to the coast, faced unfamiliar enemies, and defended the realm. The image of Japan standing against the Mongol Empire became one of the defining episodes of the Kamakura period. Still beneath the heroic memory was a quieter truth. Victory does not always strengthen a government. Sometimes it reveals the strain already inside it. The Kamakura shogunate had resisted the greatest empire of the age, but in doing so, it deepened the financial and political problems that would contribute to its decline. As we leave this stormy chapter, picture the coast of Kyushu after the typhoon has passed. Broken ships lie scattered. The sea, violent only hours before, begins to settle. Samurai look out across the water, exhausted, relieved, and uncertain. The enemy has gone. The islands remain free. Temple bells may ring in gratitude, and prayers may rise for the dead. But beyond the relief, another question remains. How long can a warrior government survive when those who defended it feel unrewarded? The Mongol threat had passed into memory, carried by the story of the divine wind. Yet, within Japan, the winds of change were still moving quietly, preparing the fall of Kamakura and the next transformation of the medieval age. Zen, the samurai, and the beauty of stillness. After the storms of the Mongol invasions, Japan remained free but not unchanged. The Kamakura shogunate had survived an enormous external threat, yet the burden of defense had weakened its foundations. Samurai had guarded the coasts, fought unfamiliar enemies, and answered the call of the military government. Many returned from that service with little reward and growing dissatisfaction. But while politics carried new strains, another kind of transformation was taking place in the spiritual and cultural life of Japan. Zen Buddhism, introduced from China during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, began to take root with special force among the warrior class. Buddhism had already been part of Japanese life for centuries, but Zen offered something that spoke directly to the world of the samurai. It emphasized disciplined meditation, direct experience, simplicity, restraint, and the acceptance of impermanence. For men whose lives were shaped by service danger and the possibility of sudden death, these teachings had a deep appeal. Zen did not ask a person to escape the world through elaborate explanations. It pointed instead toward direct awareness. Through seated meditation or zazen, the practitioner trained the mind to become still, focused, and alert. In a quiet hall before dawn or after sunset, a monk might sit without movement, breathing steadily, letting thoughts pass without clinging to them. That discipline of mind could also appeal to a warrior who needed calm in moments of fear. The samurai world was not peaceful. It was a world of loyalty, land disputes, military obligation, and uncertain fortune. A man might rise through service, lose everything through defeat, or die before his name had any chance to be remembered. Zen's emphasis on impermanence did not remove this danger, but it gave it a spiritual language. Life was brief. Power changed hands. Beauty faded. The mind had to learn steadiness inside a world that never stayed still. Zen monasteries became important centers of culture as well as religion. They were not only places of meditation, they were bridges to the continent, especially to Song and later Yuan China. Monks brought books, paintings, architectural ideas, calligraphy styles, and new ways of thinking about space, silence, and beauty. Through Zen, Japan continued to absorb Chinese influence, but once again, it transformed what it received into something distinctively Japanese. Zen architecture favored clarity and discipline. Temple compounds were often arranged to support meditation, study ritual, and contemplation. Wooden halls, tiled roofs, gates, pathways, and gardens worked together to create a physical environment of restraint. These spaces did not need to overwhelm the visitor with ornament. Their power came from proportioned quietness and the feeling that every part had been placed with care. One of Zen's most enduring contributions to Japanese culture was the dry landscape garden, or karasansui. These gardens used gravel stones, moss, and carefully limited plant life to suggest mountains, rivers, islands, seas, or abstract landscapes of the mind. Raked gravel could evoke water without containing a single drop. A cluster of rocks could suggest distant peaks. Empty space was not treated as absence, but as part of the design. This idea is central to the beauty of Zen. A garden does not need to show everything. A painting does not need to fill the entire paper. A poem does not need to explain every emotion. What is left unsaid can be as powerful as what is shown. The viewer, the listener, or the reader completes the experience inwardly. The same sensibility-shaped ink painting, monochrome landscapes, bamboo, birds, rocks, and mountains were painted with bold brushstrokes and subtle washes of ink. The goal was not photographic detail. It was to capture spirit, movement, and essence. A few lines could suggest mist over a mountain valley. A dark stroke could become a tree trunk. A blank space could become sky-water distance or silence. Calligraphy also became a spiritual act. The brush moved once. The line could not be corrected without losing its life. In that single movement, the state of the mind became visible. Too much hesitation and the line weakened. Too much force and it lost grace. The handbreadth, ink, and moment had to come together. Tea culture also carried Zen influence. Tea had been brought from China earlier and was used by monks to stay alert during meditation. Over time, the simple act of preparing and drinking tea began to gather ritual meaning. The fully developed tea ceremony would come later, but its foundations were laid in these centuries. Attention to small movements, appreciation of quiet utensils, awareness of guests, and the ability to find depth in a modest room. This was one of the great paradoxes of medieval Japan. In an age of warriors, conflict, and political uncertainty, some of the most refined ideals of stillness and restraint took shape. The sword and the brush did not belong to separate worlds as completely as we might expect. Samurai patrons supported temples, commissioned art, practiced poetry, and found in Zen a way to give their lives a sense of order beyond violence. Zen did not belong only to warriors, of course. It was part of a much wider Buddhist landscape. Pure Land Buddhism continued to offer comfort through devotion to Amida Buddha. Nichiren Buddhism called followers to passionate faith in the Lotus Sutra. Older schools, such as Tendai and Shingon, remained powerful. But Zen carved out a special place in the culture of elites, warriors, and artists because it gave form to an aesthetic that would become deeply associated with Japan: simplicity, asymmetry, discipline, suggestion, and quiet intensity. The influence of Zen reached beyond temples. It shaped the way a garden could be seen, the way a room could be arranged, the way a brush could move, the way a bowl of tea could be received with both hands, and the way silence could be understood not as emptiness, but as presence. After the Mongol invasions, Japan had good reason to think about impermanence. The greatest empire in the world had come across the sea and failed. The shogunate had survived, but at a cost. Samurai had gained honor, but not always reward. The old order still stood, yet cracks were spreading through it. Zen offered no simple solution to these problems. It did not stop political decline. It did not make warriors gentle. It did not erase ambition, fear death, or violence. But it gave medieval Japan a language of inner discipline and a vision of beauty that could survive even in unstable times. As we leave this part of the story, imagine a Zen temple in the early morning. The air is cool, gravel lies carefully raked. A monk sits in stillness. A warrior, perhaps burdened by service and memory, pauses before a garden where stones rest like islands in a silent sea. Nothing moves very much. Nothing explains itself completely. And yet, in that silence, another part of Japan's history is quietly taking shape. Ashikaga and Muromachi, weak power, deep culture. The Kamakura shogunate eventually fell in 1333, weakened by internal dissatisfaction, financial strain, and the ambitions of Emperor Go-Daigo, who sought to restore direct imperial rule. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the emperor might reclaim real political authority. This attempt, known as the Kenmu Restoration, did not last long. The society that had emerged after centuries of warrior rule could not easily return to the old aristocratic order. Many samurai who had supported Go-Daigo became dissatisfied. They expected rewards, recognition, and a government that respected the realities of warrior power. Instead, the restoration appeared to favor older courtly interests. Among the military leaders who turned against the emperor was Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful general who had first fought on Go-Daigo's side. In 1336, Takauji seized Kyoto and established a new military government, the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate. The name Muromachi comes from the district of Kyoto, where the Ashikaga shoguns later maintained their headquarters. Unlike Kamakura, which had stood apart from the old capital, the Ashikaga regime placed itself inside Kyoto's political and cultural world. This location gave the shogunate access to the prestige of the court, the temples, and the old aristocratic traditions. But it also exposed the regime to the rivalries, factions, and symbolic struggles that had long shaped Kyoto. The Ashikaga shogunate was never as firmly organized as the Kamakura government had been. Its authority depended heavily on alliances with powerful regional lords or daimyo who controlled their own territories and commanded their own samurai. The shogun could influence, negotiate reward, and sometimes punish, but his ability to command the entire country directly was limited. Power was becoming more regional, more negotiated, and more unstable. The early Ashikaga period was also marked by the division between the northern and southern courts. Emperor Go-Daigo and his descendants maintained a rival court in the south, while the Ashikaga supported a northern imperial line in Kyoto. This conflict lasted from 1336 to 1392, dividing the country not only politically, but symbolically. Even after the courts were reunited, the memory of division weakened the aura of imperial and shogunal authority. And yet, despite this political instability, the Muromachi period became one of the most creative cultural ages in Japanese history. This is one of the strange patterns we often find in Japan's past. When political power is uncertain, culture does not always decline. Sometimes it flourishes in new forms. Under Ashikaga patronage, especially during the rule of the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, Kyoto became a center of artistic refinement, religious exchange, and international diplomacy. Yoshimitsu restored relations with Ming China, opening trade that brought silk, porcelain, books, and other goods into Japan. He also sponsored one of the most famous buildings in the country, the Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakuji. Its upper stories, covered in gold leaf, reflected in the still water of its pond, created an image of power, wealth, and elegant display. Kinkakuji was not only a building, it was a statement of Ashikaga ambition, showing that even a politically fragile shogunate could surround itself with beauty and prestige. Later, another Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimasa, would be associated with the Silver Pavilion, or Ginkakuji. Unlike the golden brilliance of Kinkakuji came to represent a more subdued aesthetic. Its garden sand forms, moss paths, and quiet architecture reflected a taste for restraint, suggestion, and contemplation. Around Yoshimasa's circle grew the Higashiyama culture, which helped shape many arts later seen as deeply Japanese. Zen remained central to this cultural world. Monks continued to serve as scholars, diplomats, advisors, poets, painters, and cultural transmitters. Ink painting developed, further influenced by Chinese models, but gradually adapted to Japanese taste. Artists used empty space mist, dark brushstrokes, and soft washes to evoke landscapes that seemed to breathe. A mountain could emerge from whiteness. A small hut could sit beneath vast cliffs. A single tree could suggest both solitude and endurance. Garden design reached a high level of refinement. Dry gardens, moss gardens, pond gardens, and temple landscapes encouraged contemplation. They were carefully arranged, but not stiff. Their beauty came from balanced stone and moss form and emptiness movement and stillness. They invited the viewer to slow down, not to consume the scene quickly. No theater also developed into a mature art during the Muromachi period. Supported by the shoguns and elites, No combined poetry, music, dance masks, and slow, deliberate movement. Its plays often drew from history, legend, religion, and ghostly memory. Many No stories are not loud dramas of action, but meditations on longing, regret, and the lingering presence of the past. A No stage is spare. There is little scenery. The actor's mask changes with the angle of light. A small movement can carry enormous emotional weight. The music is restrained, sometimes haunting. Like a Zen garden or an ink painting, No leaves space for the audience's imagination. It does not explain everything it suggests. Tea culture also continued to evolve during this period. What had begun as a practice connected to monks and elite gatherings slowly became more refined and formal. Tea rooms, utensils, gestures, and the mood of the gathering all mattered. The act of drinking tea became a way to focus attention on the present moment, the bowl, the water, the guest, the season, the silence between words. The Muromachi period therefore offers a deep contrast. Politically, the Ashikaga shogunate struggled to control the daimyo and maintain national unity. Culturally, it helped nurture forms of art and thought that would endure for centuries. Kinkaku-ji, Ginkaku-ji, Zen Gardens Inc., painting No theater, and the foundations of tea culture all belong to this world of fragile power and refined beauty. For ordinary people, however, the period was not simply an age of culture. The weakening of central authority meant local conflicts, shifting taxes, insecurity, and the growing power of regional lords. Villages had to survive inside the ambitions of daimyo and samurai. Trade and towns developed in some areas, but war and uncertainty were never far away. By the 15th century, the structural weaknesses of the Ashikaga shogunate had become dangerous. The shogun's authority depended on powerful lords who were increasingly difficult to control. Succession disputes, rivalries among great families, and competition for influence at court all created pressure inside the system. That pressure finally erupted in the Onin War beginning in 1467. Kyoto, The city of refined poetry temples, screens, gardens, and ceremony became a battlefield. The war lasted for years and devastated the capital. Streets burned, mansions were destroyed. The authority of the shogunate collapsed further. When the fighting ended, it left behind not peace, but fragmentation. The Muromachi period did not end immediately with the Onin War, but something essential had broken. The center could no longer hold the country together. Regional lords would now act with greater independence. The age of competing warlords had begun. As we leave Muromachi, Kyoto, imagine two images side by side. In one, a raked garden lies still before a temple wall, every stone placed with quiet intention. In the other, smoke rises from the damaged streets of the capital after years of war. Both belong to the same period. Both are true. From this tension between beauty and disorder, Japan entered one of the most turbulent ages in its history. The Onin War and the Sengoku age, a country of warring states. The Onin War began in 1467 as a dispute over succession within the Ashikaga shogunate and among powerful military families. At first, it was a conflict rooted in elite politics, the kind of struggle that might once have been contained within Kyoto's world of factions, titles, and alliances. But the weakness of the shogunate allowed the fighting to spread and deepen. What began as a political quarrel became a long and destructive war that tore apart the capital itself. Kyoto had been the heart of Japanese court life for centuries. It was the city of Heian poetry, imperial ritual, Buddhist temples, aristocratic mansions, and later, Ashikaga cultural patronage. Yet, during the Onin War, its streets became battle lines. Estates burned. Temples and residences were damaged. The city's old elegance was scarred by years of fighting between rival armies. The war dragged on until 1477, but by the time it ended, the deeper damage had already been done. The Ashikaga shogunate remained in name, but its authority was largely broken. The emperor remained sacred, but politically weak. The great families of Kyoto no longer commanded the country with confidence. In the provinces, daimyo acted with increasing independence, building their own armies, enforcing their own laws, and pursuing their own ambitions. The period that followed is known as the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. It lasted from the late 15th century into the late 16th century, and it was one of the most turbulent eras in Japanese history. Central authority had collapsed, and Japan became a patchwork of competing domains. Daimyo fought for land survival, prestige, and eventually dominance over the entire country. Alliances formed and broke. Castles rose on hills and plains. Samurai served shifting masters. Villages found themselves caught between taxes, armies, and the need for protection. The word chaos can describe the Sengoku age, but it does not explain everything. This was not random violence without direction. It was a harsh process of political competition. Weak families were destroyed or absorbed. Stronger lords built larger territories. Successful daimyo learned that warfare alone was not enough. To survive, they had to govern. They needed laws, tax systems, roads, castle towns, markets, and loyal retainers. In that sense, the Sengoku period was both destructive and creative. Old structures collapsed, but new forms of regional government developed. A daimyo who wanted lasting power had to organize agriculture, managed resources, encourage trade, maintain discipline among warriors, and protect economic life inside his domain. The battlefield and the rice field were connected. No army could march for long without food, money, and administration behind it. Castle building became one of the defining features of the age. Earlier fortifications had often been simpler, but Sengoku castles grew more complex and more central to political power. A castle was a military stronghold, but it was also an administrative center and a symbol of authority. Around castles, towns developed. Merchants, craftsmen, laborers, and retainers gathered near the protection and demands of the Lord. These castle towns would later become important foundations of urban life in early modern Japan. War also changed in practical ways. Armies grew larger. Foot soldiers known as ashigaru became increasingly important. Samurai remained elite warriors, but they no longer fought only in small mounted groups. Mass infantry, coordinated tactics, and disciplined formations became more common. The arrival of firearms from Portuguese traders in the 16th century accelerated this transformation. The arquebus, or matchlock gun, did not immediately replace older weapons, but it changed the possibilities of battle. A warrior did not need a lifetime of archery training to use a firearm effectively in formation. Daimyo, who adopted guns, produced them in quantity, and trained troops to use them, could gain decisive advantages. The sound of gunfire entered Japanese warfare, and with it came a new kind of battlefield. Foreign contact brought more than firearms. Portuguese merchants introduced new goods, new commercial connections, and Christianity. Jesuit missionaries found converts among some daimyo and common people. For certain warlords, Christianity was not only a religion, but also a possible link to trade weapons and foreign influence. For others, it represented a threat to older religious and political structures. The Sengoku age was therefore not isolated. Even in the midst of civil war, Japan was connected to wider currents of global change. Religious institutions also played military roles. Some Buddhist temple complexes were wealthy, fortified, and politically powerful. Leagues of militant believers, especially the Iko-Ikki, associated with Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, controlled territories and resisted daimyo authority. These groups blurred the line between spiritual community and military power. A warlord seeking unification could not ignore them. For ordinary villagers, the Sengoku age could be frightening and exhausting. Armies needed food. Lords demanded taxes and labor. Fields could be damaged by campaigns. Families might flee violence or seek protection under stronger local powers. Yet, villages were not helpless. Some organized self-defense, some negotiated with lords, some shifted loyalty when survival required it. The common people of this period were not merely background figures. They were part of the social fabric that made war and rule possible. At the same time, the instability of the age created unusual mobility. In a rigidly ordered society, birth determines much of life. But during the Sengoku period, talent, daring, and opportunity could sometimes push a man upward. Skilled warriors, clever administrators, and ambitious retainers could rise if they attached themselves to a successful lord. The old aristocratic world of inherited rank had weakened. A harsher, more fluid world had taken its place. This was the world that produced figures such as Uesugi Kenshin, Takeda, Shingen, Mori Motonari, Hojo Sound, and many others. Each controlled regions, fought rivals, built administrations, and left behind stories of strategy, honor, rivalry, and ambition. But among all the warlords of the Sengoku age, one figure would become the first of Japan's three great unifiers. His name was Oda Nobunaga. By the middle of the 16th century, the pattern of Sengoku conflict had begun to change. Smaller lords had been absorbed, larger domains had formed. The dream of national unification, once almost impossible to imagine, became a practical ambition for those powerful enough to attempt it. To unify Japan would require more than bravery. It would require ruthlessness, innovation, economic strength, strategic vision, and a willingness to destroy old institutions that stood in the way. The Sengoku age, for all its suffering, had prepared the conditions for this. It had tested leaders constantly. It had rewarded adaptation. It had shown which methods worked and which failed. It had created armies, castle towns, tax systems, trade networks, and hardened warrior societies. Out of more than a century of disorder, the possibility of a new order began to emerge. As we pause at the edge of that transformation, imagine Japan at night during the Sengoku period. Castles stand on distant hills. Watch fires burn in the dark. Roads are dangerous but full of movement. Messengers, merchants, monks, soldiers, farmers carrying goods and spies, traveling quietly between domains. Somewhere, a daimyo studies a map by lamplight. Somewhere else, a village listens for the sound of approaching troops. The country is divided, but division has created ambition. And soon one warlord will begin to break the old disorder apart. And now, as our journey comes to rest, let the story settle gently. Let the noise of battles fade. Let the black ships drift back into mist. Let the streets of Edo grow quiet. History is vast, but tonight we have walked through it slowly, one age at a time. If you are still awake, thank you for staying with me until the end of this long journey. And if you drifted somewhere along the way, that is perfectly all right too. Some stories are meant not only to be followed, but to carry us softly toward rest. Before we say good night, take one more slow breath. Feel the room around you. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the distant islands of Japan with their forests, temples, fields, castles, and quiet shores fade gently into the background of sleep. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope this journey brought you calm curiosity and a little peace at the end of your day. Goodbye for now, pals. Sleep well, and good night.